Tonight, I want to talk to you about hidden ways the Gospels prove reliable. Now, if you've been in apologetics or studied the faith at any point, there are certain arguments for the reliability of Scripture that are common, that people tend to use over and over again. These arguments are probably two that you haven't heard much about. One of them is a very, very new argument, only made possible by modern technology, and the other one is a very, very old argument. So I hope to kind of give you some new insight thinking about the gospel in ways that we hadn't thought about before. If you'll turn, first of all, to Luke chapter 1, we're just going to jump in, and first of all, let me say a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you so much that you are the God of the universe. We thank you, Lord, for all that you've given us. You've given us the ability to love you with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we choose to do that now. Help us build our minds, to build our hearts, to share with others, and to draw more people into your kingdom. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Luke chapter 1. Luke does something interesting in his beginning of the gospel. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things that you have been taught." Now, there's a lot of claims that Luke is making in here. He's saying that he wanted to put things in a proper order. He says that he interviewed eyewitnesses. He was the first century Lee Strobel, if you will. Went around, talked to some of these experts, and got the testimony direct from the horse's mouth so that you can know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. Now, when we first start talking, I got to apologize a little bit for the slides. I created them in a font that wasn't that. So tomorrow they'll look a little better. But regardless, when we talk about gospel transmission, most people assume that the gospels were passed from person to person and the Bible was finally written down like this, like the game of telephone. Anybody remember the game of telephone as a kid? Okay. This is when you talk to atheists, this is what they'll say. How can you believe a Bible that's been, what? Translated so many times. Right? That's what they say. Now, what's your first response to that? The Bible in your laps, how many times has it been translated? Anybody? Oh, I got a news for you. The Bible in your laps has been translated once from the original manuscripts. Not the original autographs, but the manuscripts, copies that we have, that we know. So the translation is not the issue. All Bibles have been translated one time into the language in which you read. There's not this multiple transmission. Remember, telephone is a game designed to make you mess up the message. I mean, think about it. You only tell one person, and that person has to whisper it to another person, and that person has to whisper it to another, all the way, and it's usually a very kind of long, complex sentence, so that by at the end of the game, what you hear is nothing like what the original sentence was. I mean, that's why it's designed like that. So we know the Bible isn't translated over and over, but they would say, well, wait a minute, but the people that talked about it before it was written down, they passed it on like this. And I say, no, that's not the right model. What if the model is something more akin to this? Now, in high school, I was a wrestler. That's what I did. Didn't do any fighting. I didn't want to mess up my face any more than is necessary. So I wrestled in school. How do you learn wrestling? Does the coach show you one time and then you show your friend and then he shows his friend? Is that the way you learn how to wrestle? No. The coach shows you and then repeats it, and then you practice it, and then you all learn together. And there are other people who can critique you and maybe tell you what techniques you're doing wrong. This is another way of transmission of a skill that can last for generations. You talk to guys who studied karate or some of these other ancient Eastern art forms, and you'll find that they last for centuries intact because of the way they're transmitted. So even if there's a long gap between the origin and the copies that we have, it isn't necessarily the case that those copies were corrupted. If the transmission was more like wrestling and less like telephone. But we don't have to rely only on that. There's some interesting developments that have happened. And this gentleman, Dr. Richard Bauckham, wrote a book in 2007 called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he says in that book, quote, "We need to recover the sense in which the Gospels are testimony. This does not mean they are testimony rather than history. It means that the kind of historiography they are is testimony." So we need to treat the Gospels maybe the way people in a court of law would treat an eyewitness. Testimony. Now, not all eyewitnesses are reliable in everything, and some eyewitnesses can't be trusted. They're out for themselves. How do we check the reliability of testimony? So the questions occur, number one, why should we think this is eyewitness testimony? And how do we test for testimony versus fable? Okay? Well, we have to look at the origin of the Gospels and where they were written. Now, where they were written is key to Dr. Baukham's argument. When we look at the Gospels, they seem to the conservative scholars within Christianity hold that they were written sometime before the end of the first century, and they were written in Koinonia Greek. That's pretty much attested, somewhere between 35 to 65 years after the events occurred. Now, that's not a long time in terms of ancient manuscripts between the source and the events, I should say, and recording them, because it came from an oral society. They were much more adept at memorization. Even today, and Abdu can attest to this, in alternately literate societies or pre-literate societies, you have people who are able to memorize vast quantities of scripture. There are people in poorer Muslim nations that can cite complete sections of the Quran, maybe even the entire Quran, by memory and get it right. So they had memorized things much more, their memories were much more exercised and much more adept. But the key here is we're talking about eyewitness testimony. So how do we check that out? Well, first of all, we ask where the sources came from. Now, in church tradition, Book of Matthew was probably written in Judea. It was probably written in the Jewish nation area, whereas most people hold that Mark was written in Rome. Luke was written somewhere in Antioch or Achaia, somewhere in that area, and John was probably written in Turkey or Ephesus, what they called Asia Minor back in those days, okay? What's this got to do with anything? Well, notice these are 4 different countries. These are 4 different areas of the world, okay? If the people writing them were not eyewitnesses, and they were written in those 4 different countries, we would expect influence from those countries to show up in the gospel accounts, right? Now, that's the church tradition. In non-church tradition, it's worse. Mainstream scholars, Gerd Thiessen believes that Matthew was written in Syria, that Mark was written in Syria, Luke was in Rome, and John, Palestine, Syria, and then Asia Minor. So again, outside of Judea for the most part. And then, of course, guys like Bart Ehrman would say all of the Gospels were written outside the Palestinian borders. Okay? So they all hold to the fact that the Gospels were not all written inside Judea in the first century. They were written in other places. Well, why is this a big deal? Well, the big deal is remembering names is tough. What does that mean? Well, there's a lot of names in the Gospels, right? Okay. Remembering names is hard. Now, I have a problem with this, and bear with me for a minute. I can usually remember the first letter of a person's first name, and my wife jabs at me all the time when I do this, because she'll tell me something, then a week later I say, and when you were talking to Jenny, and she goes, Jenny? Oh, you mean Julie? Yes, Julie, that's it. And Edward, you mean Eric? Yes, Eric. So I can get the first letter right most of the time, but I have a hard time with the rest of the name. Remembering names is tough on most people, right? Would you agree when you meet somebody? Okay. Guess what? Inventing names is tougher. If the Gospels were written in areas outside of Palestine, the writers would have to invent the characters that are portrayed within the Gospel accounts, right? So imagine you're writing a story. You're going to write a fictional account. Maybe you're writing a movie screenplay. You want to bring back the John Hughes teenage comedy. Okay, Molly Ringwald's too old, so you have to find another one. But you want to name these characters. You're writing a story set in Southern California in the 1980s. What names would you give the characters? Most people writing today would choose names that they're familiar with today, right? These are the names that you know. So you might get a lot of Brittany's or, Jasons or things like that. But that wouldn't fit for people in the 1980s because Brittany and Jason didn't work. It's hard to invent names for a location. It takes a little bit of work. But I got one more for you. Imagine if you're not writing a script for 1980s Southern California, but 1960s Paris. Now you've got a whole big kettle of fish to deal with in naming all of the characters within your storyline. You see how difficult that is? Well, this is what we see in the Gospels. Guess what? The Gospels have a lot of names that's used throughout the four books and the book of Acts, if you look at it that way. And you start to wonder, how do those compare to what we know about first century Palestine? Well, as I said, before we got to the new millennium, this was fairly impossible to do, but this lady here, and she's a scholar named Tal Ilian, put out a book. Actually put out 3 books. She ran all these, she took the different documents that we know have come from Palestine, from say 300 BC to 70 AD or so, or even later, and she had several different sources. You can see she had the gospel accounts. She had the work of Josephus, because Josephus was a very prolific writer within Judaism, and he recorded histories. So she put every name from the Gospels in a computer, every name from Josephus in a computer. She put the names of what they would find on the sides of ossuaries. Now, ossuaries are very interesting. These are bone boxes, burial boxes, that was unique to first century Palestine. So when somebody had died, they would lay their body in a tomb, and they would wait about a year for all of the flesh to decay, and then they would scoop up the bones and they would put them in a bone box. They'd move that box off to a shelf in the family crypt. It's too expensive to dig a hole in the cave for every person who died, so they would recycle it this way. You put a little bone box up there, and it's a lot smaller, a lot more compact for people to fit. Well, all these bone boxes have names on them, so it's a pretty good, and the correlation in first century, I believe, was 1 out of every 1 people die. So it's probably a pretty good correlation to the kind of popularity of names in that day. And then she took the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a few other things, where when people would do transactions, you'd have bills of sale and things like that she could gather. Anyway, she put all of these things together with the dates that she knew and threw them into a big computer. And the ossuaries of all, of course, provided the biggest results, but she found a couple of interesting things. First of all, she found that most naming conventions didn't change as much as they do now. People were fairly consistent in the way they would name people from generation to generation. And most names came from ossuaries in the first century. So by the vast majority, we could date the names within the ossuaries to the first century because that's when they were used. Now, let me give you some examples of how this works. Today, if you look for the popular names, and this came off of, by the way, you can do this. You can go to the Social Security website. This comes from the United States Social Security website. You can plug in your name and the year you were born, and you can find out how popular your name was in the year you were born. Basically, how many other people showed up. And this is on your notes. If you got the handouts, it should be on the second page. So I have given you guys all of these tables. In 2010, for example, Jacob was the most, now remember, Social Security office assigns Social Security numbers the year you're born now. So it's a pretty good indication. Jacob was first with only 1.08% of the population being named Jacob. That was the number one name for males. And Isabella is 1.17. That was the most popular female name in 2010. Okay? You can see Ethan, Michael, Jaden, William, Alexander, Noah, Daniel. So in 2030, if you're setting your story in 2030, Jacob and Isabella can be a couple. Because in 2030, they'll both be 20 years old, and it makes sense. Jacob and Isabella in 2010, would that make sense? Well, not really, because if you look back to 1980, Michael and Jennifer were the most popular names people gave their children in 1980. So if you use Jacob and Isabella today for a story set today, they better be in three-cornered shorts to be believable. Otherwise, Michael and Jennifer would make more sense. Now, I just want to pick out one section here. Look at Matthew and Heather. Matthew was the sixth most popular name in 1980, 2.04%. Heather was 1.12%, sixth most popular name, right? How many Heathers do you guys know today? By the way, why do you think Heather was so popular in 1980? Anybody guess? Heather Locklear. People tend to name folks after television personalities or characters. In 1996-97, the name Ross all of a sudden shot out of nowhere because Friends became a huge hit. That's the way we name people today. But if you look again, popularity names I rank, you take Matthew and Heather over the decades, and you see it wasn't always that way. In 1960, Heather was 298th most popular, not very popular at all. So although Heather Locklear is popular in the movies, if you have a whole lot of Heathers running around in your story of 1980, it's not going to be very believable. So you see how this works. You start looking at the names and you start to say, what makes sense for the New Testament, which is claims to be first century eyewitness material, based on the names that, now, Tal Alien is a Jew. She's not a Christian at all. She's just interested in how the naming conventions in the culture works. Richard Bauckham, however, takes it and makes some extrapolations. First of all, and I'll pull the table. I think this one is on the very back page. Oh, I have it here because I didn't pull it. Yeah, you can look at the very back page because I don't believe I put, yeah, that's in there. Okay, the top 11 male names in ancient Jewish Palestine, all right? And here you have the 4 different sources that were used to count these names. Rank number 1, Simon or Simeon. That was the most popular name in first century Palestine. You can see it. They had a total of 243 occurrences across her different sources, 8 of which appear in the New Testament. Josephus has a Simon or Simeon 29 different times. The ossuaries show Simon or Simeon showing up 59 different times and 72 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Number 2, Joseph or Joses. 218 times it shows up, 6 in the New Testament, 21 in Josephus, 45 times in the ossuaries and on the way down. So you have Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, Jesus or Joshua, which is a same name, Ananias, Jonathan, Matthew or Matthias, Menachem, James, and Jacob. So those are the top 11 names that appear in the New Testament with the possible exception of Jonathan, that also appear in these other areas, ranked by their frequency of appearance in these documents. Okay? So you following me? Notice how closely the numbers exist in the New Testament. Notice how they go down for the most part, with maybe the exception of Lazarus. With the New Testament, in the same way they go down in Josephus, the same way they go down in the ossuaries, the same way they go down in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It seems that the names in the non-biblical sources, the frequency of those names, like in bone boxes, match the names of the New Testament pretty darn closely. Now, in the top Jewish names, in Israel, the top two names were Simon and Joseph. 15.9% of Israel names are Simon or Joseph. In the Gospel of Acts, that happens 18.2% of the time. Top 9 male names, 41.5%. Those top 9 in this last slide I showed you. So if you look at the top 9 here, 41% of all names in Jewish antiquity that we know of fall into these top 9 category, and 40%, if you just limit it to the New Testament, those top 9 names are 40% of the whole names of the New Testament. That's pretty close. In the female names, it's a little difficult with females because not as many women were mentioned in the biblical accounts, so the numbers start to diverge a little bit more. But they don't diverge so much as to make it worthwhile. The top 2 female names were Mary and Salome, and they happened 28.6% of the time in non-biblical sources, and 39.9% of the time in biblical sources. And of the top 9, you have 49.7% non-biblical versus 61% biblical. That's pretty close. That's pretty good. What I'm saying is, if you were faking this, if you were writing a novel about 1960s Paris, and you had mentioned 100 characters, 40% of the characters' names that you mentioned would correspond to 40% of the people who were born in 1940 Paris or so. You see what I'm saying? That's a hard thing to invent, especially if you're a first century writer. Now, you may say, well, but they're Jews. That's not fair. I mean, there's a whole culture. Well, it just so happens that there were a lot of Jews living in other areas at that time. When you look at names in Palestine, again, you see the top 6, right? Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judah, John, Jesus, okay? But when you look at the names outside of Palestine, it's fascinatingly different. Names in Egypt, these are Jewish enclaves, and there was a large Jewish population in Egypt, because Tala didn't stop with merely Palestinian names. She made a distinction. Here are the top names in non-Palestinian areas. You have Eleazar, Sabbatus, Joseph, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, and Samuel. Now these are interesting. Why were certain names popular in Palestine, but they weren't popular in other areas? As a matter of fact, we find this Egyptian pattern much more common in other Jewish communities outside of Palestine. And Bauckham offers two pieces. First of all, 6 of the 9 most popular names inside Palestine were names that were common to the Hasmonean dynasty, basically the last Jewish ruling body that existed. So there was patriotism involved. These people were celebrating their homeland. They were patriotic Jews, lived in the promised land. The last independent rule of Jews were the Hasmoneans, and everybody's naming their kids after their heroes, which aren't television stars. They happen to be the last ruling body of the Jews. On other cities and areas, the names became a better link to their religious affiliation. Other names were popular because they included in some way or implied the divine name. So you see Eleazar, right, the El. You Samuel, so the name of God. Or you have Joseph, which was, the hero of the book of Genesis, who where nothing bad was spoken of, things like that. So non-Palestinian names are more linked to biblical stories and characters, or they reflected the name of God himself, and that's why people were naming it. It wasn't a political thing like the Palestinian names. It was something different, the non-Palestinian names. So let's think about this for a minute. All 4 Gospels were written outside of Judea, maybe the exception of Matthew if we're talking church tradition. Skeptics will argue, maybe not. But all 4 Gospels, when you put them together and you look at the frequency of names that show up in the Gospel accounts, match sometimes within 1 or 2% of the frequency of names that we find in all other written literature. Now, is that good evidence to say that maybe these tales are truly eyewitness tales? They weren't invented. Pretty tough to invent that kind of detail, especially when the 4 writers are not working with each other, but in separate areas. Now, again, it gets a little difficult because, as I said, there wasn't nearly the diversity within Judea, within naming conventions, as there is today. So, when you read the Bible, you may not see it quite the same way. Not every Simon is a Simon, if you will. So how do they tell Simons from Simons? Well, the biblical accounts will show that, by the way, the more popular names will have some kind of distinction to them, whereas the less popular names don't. See, Dr. Fernandez did a great job. He said he'd never met a Lenny before, so he thought that using that name was safe. Right? So he has to just say Lenny. He doesn't have to, not that Lenny, but some other Lenny. He doesn't have to make a distinction. But when you have a whole bunch of Simons running around, you have to make a distinction, and this is what they do. When you start reading the gospel accounts, you'll notice that the most frequent names use these kinds of distinctions. For example, variants. Jesus' brother Joseph was called Joseph. See, there are a lot of Josephs running around, so you'll read in the Gospels where Jesus' brother Joseph was called Joseph. There's a variant in order to distinguish him from other Josephs that you might bump into. Or Zacchaeus, which is a variant of Zechariah. It's kind of a way to, right? We called the 43rd president, W, to make George W. Bush different than George Herbert Walker Bush, although George Herbert Walker Bush has a W in the middle of his name too. But we make a distinction by using a variant. Or we'll use a patronymic. Patronymic. John, the son of Zechariah, right, in John chapter 3. John, this guy's son, that's the John I'm talking about. Or Simon Bar-Jonah. Again, these are the most popular names in Palestine. So not only are the writers using them with the proper frequency, when they talk about them, even if there's no other Simon mentioned, they're making a distinction because that's how they would be familiar with those guys. We would make the distinction of W even if other people don't recognize George Herbert Walker Bush. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that we see over and over. Or a husband's or a son's name, for example. You have Matthew 20:20, where the mother of the sons of Zebedee. There's a ton of Marys running around in the Bible. It was 24%, I think. It was the most popular name for women beyond reproach. So they have to, the writers have to, no, mother of the sons of Zebedee, that's the Mary I'm talking about. Or a place of origin, Jesus of Nazareth. Right? Again, Jesus, very popular name. And then we have nicknames like Simon, who's called Cephas, to distinguish him from Simon the Zealot. See that distinguished there. But when you get to, and then even occupations like Simon the leper, Simon of Cyrene, Simon the tanner. What's interesting is when you get to less common names, such as Jairus in Mark 5:22, and Luke 8:47, you don't get a distinction. He's just Jairus. Why is he just Jairus? Jairus the centurion. No, the writer doesn't have to do that. Why? Because there's only one Jairus running around. There's a ton of Simons running around. Or we have James the Little, right? In Simon the leper and John the baptizer. But Cleopas, in Luke 24, there's only one Cleopas. We don't talk about Cleopases. And even what's interesting is when you look at this and you look at, say, some of the apocryphal gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, you see the Gospel of Thomas using Didymus, Judas, Thomas, James the Just, Simon Peter. They use those kinds of phrases because they're popular from the Gospels, but they just use Jesus, Matthew, Thomas, Mary, and Salome. They don't distinguish those. So even the Gospel of Thomas misses by not making those distinctions. In the Gospel of Mary, you have the names of the Savior, Peter, Mary, Andrew, and Levi. Again, no distinctions made. In the Gospel of Judas, you have Judas Iscariot, Jesus. You have heavenly beings, Barbellos. So now the Gospel of Judas is probably written somewhere in the mid-2nd century, mid to late 2nd century. It's Gnostic. And here are the names that show up. Barbellos, Sophia, Nebro, Yaldaboth, Salcus, Seth, Harmonoth, Galila, Yodel, Adonias, Adam, Eve, Zoe, Michael, and Gabriel. So those names aren't even close to, this is just 100 years later that the Gospel of Judas is written, supposedly another gospel. Name's not even close. So you get the testimony, and this is exactly what Bauckham says. He says that the names of Palestinian Jews in the Gospel and Acts coincide very closely with the names of the general population of Jewish Palestine in this period, but not to the names of Jews in the diaspora. In this light, it becomes very unlikely that those in the Gospels are late accreditations to the traditions. In other words, if the Gospels have correctly gotten these details of the hardest things to remember correct, wouldn't it follow that they would get some of the easier stuff right? And again, names are difficult because there's no correlation between names. When you have eyewitnesses, when there's a crime scene, the first thing investigators will do is they'll find out who witnessed it, and they'll quickly separate the witnesses. Why do they separate the witnesses? Because they want to make sure that one witness isn't influencing another. There's a difference between corroboration and collusion. So you put everybody in a separate room, right? If the witnesses tell the exact same story, you've got a problem. Well, this is going to bring us to our second point. How can we know that this is testimony rather than fable? And this is a very, very interesting topic. Dr. Timothy McGrew first brought it to my attention, but it's actually something that's been around for a very, very long time. And again, I want you to think about how eyewitnesses are treated. They're pulled apart into separate sections because each one of them will have a little bit different account of what they saw, with the events that occurred. Collusion is suspected when the stories match one another in delivery and detail, but eyewitnesses corroborate stories when one provides a detail that wasn't included or differs from the other. Helps to explain the full scene. For example, if you're talking to two different people who saw a car accident, the first person may say, well, the green car accelerated through the red light and smashed into the blue car. And the second person may say, well, I don't know, I saw the red car turning right, and then the green car smashed into him. And you might be able to draw something from those two accounts and say, okay, so we know the green car was accelerating as the red car, trying to beat the light maybe, as the red car suddenly turned right, and that's what caused the accident. You have more detail from two different independent sources than you would with either alone. Do you understand how that could kind of work? Okay, this is called supporting evidence. And what we see in this book, first put out by John James Blunt in 1869, actually, a long time ago, was he provides a list of the four Gospels where he starts taking apart the different stories of the Gospel accounts, and he finds that there's a lot of these undesigned coincidences that seem to occur within the stories. Okay? And that's what we want to do. An undesigned coincidence occurs when one account of an event leaves out a bit of information that doesn't affect the overall picture, but the different account indirectly supplies the missing detail, usually answering some natural question raised by the first. Now, forgers don't want to leave loose ends like this that might raise awkward questions. They usually take care to tie everything together neatly, but these are just the sort of things we would expect to find in authentic and at least partially independent records of the same real events told by different people. And I'm going to give you some examples. Now, there's going to be a lot of text here. You don't have to worry about all the text. You can just write down the scriptures and go back and look them up later. The first one is Jesus calls of the first disciples. Now, this is always one, whenever I read the Bible and I come across something that bothers me, or if you come across something that bothers you, rejoice, because there's a treasure there waiting to be found if you just dig hard enough. This is one of the ones that have always bothered me. In Matthew 4, it says, "Now Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee. He saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter," notice the name distinction, "and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending the nets. And he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed them." So we have Peter and Andrew fishing. They immediately left their nets to follow Jesus. John and James were mending their nets, and also they left their nets to follow Jesus. So I picture Peter and Andrew over here, Jesus walking along the shore, and maybe they come in after, "Hey, you guys come in and follow me," and they come right in, leave the boat, start walking. And Jesus and these three guys are walking along, come along, James and John. "Hey, you follow me too." And they said, "Okay, Pop, we'll see you later," and they go. Does that bother anybody? It's like, what kind of magic is this? Well, here's an interesting thing. If you go to Luke's account in Luke 5, you learn a little bit of detail. Luke writes, "Now it happened while the crowd was pressing around him." Oh, there's a crowd there. See, I never pictured that. "And listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats lying at the edge of the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, 'Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch.' Simon answered and said, 'Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But I will do as you say and let down the nets.' When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And when they came and filled both boats, they began to sink, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, 'Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man.' For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not fear, from now on you will be catching men.' When they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him." Now we get a little bit more detail. What do we learn? First of all, Jesus doesn't just walk up and say, "Hey, follow me," and everybody says, "Oh, okay," like a robot. It's like a Pied Piper scenario. That's not what happened. There was a crowd who came to see Jesus. Jesus says, "Hey, you guys, want to borrow your boats? Let's go out a little bit so I can address all these people." They say, "Well, he's a pretty famous preacher. Yeah, we'll do that." They do that. Then after his speech, after his sermon, he says, "Let's go out into deep water and catch fish." Peter's like, "Dude, we're fishermen. We've been out all night. But out of respect, we'll go out into the deep water and catch fish. We know that there's no fish there. We're professionals. Like, you're in over your head. You don't know. You know preaching. We know fish." That was Peter's idea. So they went out into the deep water. Peter and Andrew start pulling in such a great catch that they can't even contain it. So they have to call the other boat over, their partners. "Hey, John and James, you get your boat out here too. We need to haul this stuff up." The catch was so great, Peter's immediately taken aback. "My Lord, I'm a sinful man." Now, does this set the stage for Peter to leave and follow Jesus? Yes. By the way, what happens to Peter's equipment? Well, chances are Peter and Andrew didn't own the boat, or at least didn't own it completely. They were partners with James and John, whose father was Zebedee, who didn't leave. Zebedee didn't leave. So when Peter and Andrew leave their things, it's okay. John says, "Pop's got it. He'll put them all away for us." Right? What's James and John doing in Matthew? By the time Jesus gets to James and John, they're not only already at the shore, but they're mending their nets. Why are they mending their nets in Matthew? Because Luke says that their nets started to break because of the great catch. Luke explains the mending of the nets that Matthew mentions because of the great catch. Matthew shows the call of the disciples, but Luke provides the motivation for answering that call. Now, why would Matthew, if he's inventing this story, leave out the fact that Jesus did this great miracle so that Simon and Andrew could could leave and follow him? Wouldn't it make the story more plausible if he told the whole thing? Why would Matthew invent mending the nets, and yet Luke doesn't talk at all about that, though the nets were going to be broken in the Gospel of Luke? Matter of fact, Matthew doesn't talk that James and John and Simon and Andrew are partners at all. We have to find that out in the parallel account in Luke. But you see how one source supports the other. Now imagine trying to forge this. Pretty rough going. This isn't the only one, guys. Here's another one, Matthew 8. The healings at evening. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. She got up and waited on him. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out spirits with a word, and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the Isaiah the prophet. He to himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. There's a little clause in that, Matthew 8. When evening came. Well, that's strange. It seems like everywhere Jesus goes, he was mobbed by people who would want to, right? He had to pull away from others, remember? He had to say, it's too much. I got to go alone someplace to pray. I got to go alone. We need a break from all of this. They went through Samaria. That's where they met the woman at the well in order so that they could get a break from the crowds who continually asked for healing. Why did they wait till evening to talk to Jesus about this? Well, the answer is in Mark's account. In verse 21, it says they went into Capernaum. Okay, this is at the very beginning of the story. They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. So this is Peter's house in Capernaum. I've actually been there. And Jesus, first thing he does is he goes in the synagogue to preach. Well, why is he going in the synagogue? Because that's where all the people are. Why are all the people there? Because it was the Sabbath day. It was Saturday. What happens to Jews on the Sabbath? No work can be done. You can't journey far. You have to stay at home. So, verse 29, it says, and immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with fever. So we know that he went into the Sabbath, and immediately he left the Sabbath. But it wasn't until evening, Matthew tells us, that all the people brought their sick. Because it wasn't until evening that it was lawful in Judaism to carry a burden to haul the sick over. Remember, Jesus got into big trouble, right? From the guy who was, take up your bed and walk. Oh, you're making a person labor on the Sabbath, that kind of thing. This doesn't make any sense unless you put the two stories together. And this is what eyewitness testimony does. It starts to make sense out of things when you put the two stories together. I'll give you one more example. And this is always a classic one because the feeding of the 5,000 actually occurs in all four Gospels. So it's a really good way to start comparing different accounts. The feeding of the 5,000. First of all, the grass. Now, again, this is an insignificant detail. If you're inventing a story, you may write the grass. That's just what you do. You don't care really too much about detail. Any good story writer will tell you the more detail you ascribe, the more details you have to track, right? Anytime you tell a lie and the lie gets more intricate, now you got to remember all of those details the next time you tell the lie. But here, in the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew 14:19 talks about the grass. Mark 6:39 says it was green grass. John 6:10 said much grass. Now, if you've ever been to that area of Israel, northeast Israel, you'll notice that, matter of fact, it's really interesting. Israel is much like the inland empire where I come from. The weather is very, very similar. And they don't get a lot of rain. It's an arid climate. It's a desert climate. And grass doesn't grow it's not like here, folks. I mean, you're lucky to get 14 inches of rain a year in these areas. So in order for grass to grow and grass to be green, it usually signals after a rain. Now, there were two seasons of rains in Israel. You had the spring rains and the fall rains. The fall rains were usually right after you plant most of your after you've harvested most of your food or before you've harvested, and the spring rains were the early rains. These seem to be indicating the spring rains. Because in John chapter 6, he says, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now, the barley doesn't come into harvest in Judea usually until after the season of the spring rains. That's when barley comes into harvest. Barley is, by the way, the cheapest of all the grains. It wasn't the best. It was the low-budget grain. So you'd only bake barley bread if you didn't have anything else, which is why that we can kind of imply that it was the spring season. Otherwise, you'd use some of the other grains, wheats or something like that, that were more abundant in the fall. But barley is available to harvest in the spring, where the other grains were available more in the fall. And you can check that by cross-referencing it with Ruth chapter 2, when she was laying at the feet of Boaz during the time of the harvest. Okay, so we have the green grass and the barley loaves in John. We have 2 things that work together. But that's not all. Jesus, it says in John 6, crossed the Sea of Galilee with Matthew, right? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke call it some kind of a deserted place, some place that wasn't highly popular, basically outside the city. When they say deserted, they mean it's not a town, or it's someplace isolated from towns and things like that. Luke 9 says that he withdrew privately to a town called Bethsaida. Okay? And in John chapter 6, crowds find him, and they start to crowd around him. Now, there's towns around, but there's no town in the center of where Jesus is preaching. And it says in John chapter 6, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Okay, why did he ask Philip? I would always have thought, oh, well, Philip was the guy who is, it's his turn for the final. That was what I assumed at first. But no, that's not what happened. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing is if you look back in John chapter 1, John introduces Philip and he says, Philip was from Bethsaida, the hometown of Andrew and Peter. Now they withdrew privately to the area of Bethsaida, and Philip was from Bethsaida. So now you have Jesus asking Philip, where would we get enough food to feed these people? Why is he asking Philip? Because Philip was the hometown guy. Okay, don't ask me how to get from here to Seattle. I don't know. Siri may know, and I may have to ask her, but I don't know because I don't live around here. You guys would know though, right? So it makes sense that Jesus would ask Philip because he was a hometown guy. By the way, it throws in an extra thing in John 1. It says, oh, by then Andrew and Peter were from there too. It was the hometown of Andrew and Peter. In Mark 6:33, when the crowds start following Jesus, it said, many saw them leaving and recognized them. Didn't recognize Jesus, but recognized them. Who does the them they're talking about? Well, if you read the passage in Mark, it's Andrew and Peter that they're recognizing. They're recognizing the disciples. Why are they recognizing the disciples? Because those guys were from that town, and they had more recognizable faces. See, back in the first century, you couldn't Google a guy to see what he looked like before you met him. How many of you do that? You're going to go to a conference or maybe a class reunion. Oh my gosh, I need to, look up names and faces. Because looking in your yearbook, let me just tell you something. 30 years since I've been in high school. Don't look at the high school yearbook and then expect to go to the class reunion and recognize people. That's a bad plan. People change in 30 years. Time is not kind. It just can't be for a lot of people. So best to go on Facebook and look up people. What do they look like now? Okay, now and then it also avoids the whole, man, you're as big as a whale. You don't want to do that either. But they couldn't do that in the first century, so a lot of people wouldn't have recognized Jesus. They wouldn't have known what he looked like at all. Oh, you mean the guy with the long hair and the beard? Yeah, that's everybody, right? It's like that metal band that wears a lot of leather and plays real loud. You know those guys? Yeah, exactly. So how could they recognize these guys? They recognized Andrew and Peter because they were hometown boys. They had seen them before. But that's what we see here in the feeding of the 5,000. And when you start going into these gospel accounts, And again, by the way, Blunt's book, if you're really interested in these undesigned coincidences, this book is out of copyright, and you can go, the best place to pick it up is on McGrew's site, Dr. Tim McGrew's site, which is called historicalapologetics.com. If you go there, you can download the entire book and read it for yourself for free. He has a whole PDF, or he'll link you, I think, to the Google Books version. You can actually type it into Google Books as well, and read the whole thing for no charge, because it's freely available. This stuff was known 150 years ago. Sometimes we, in our new technology and our lust for new arguments, forget that some of the older arguments are some of the best ones. So what does this argue? Well, I would say that, number one, in order for the Gospels to invent naming conventions that match to within 2 or 3 percentage points of the actual names we know were popular within Palestinian first century inside Judea, and not to make the mistakes of, say, the Gospel of Judas, which uses vastly different names, that's pretty good. And remember, the Gospel of Judas was trying to pass itself off as a gospel too, and it fails in that regard. To define the most popular names by qualifiers and leave the least popular names unqualified, that's either writing genius that surpasses anything I can imagine today, or it's eyewitness testimony. To take multiple accounts and leave out bits here that are explained there, and only get the complete picture when you put all 4 of them together, that's not an argument for collusion or creation. It's not fable. It's fact. It's history. It's how we today convict people and put them in jail by saying, we know you did it, here's the evidence. So it holds up. What I would say is that the gospel message proves to be reliable because there are hidden passages, there are hidden evidences that would be impossible for the writers to make up any other way. Okay, we have time for a few questions. Look at I've stunned you all. It's like...
Well, I'll ask you a question then. You talked about variants, and one of the ways that we could know the variant. Well, I guess my question is, how do we know that it is a variant of the original name and not just a different person? I imagine by some comparison and stuff, but there must be some other reasons.
Well, if you're familiar with the naming conventions, first of all, because, number one, Jewish names of antiquity were much narrower, and Jewish families would always name children usually within a family name. If you remember in the temple, Zechariah was going to have John the Baptist. And remember the big brouhaha that showed up? He said, you can't name him John. Nobody in your family's named John. See, that was the common thought back then. And it wasn't until he scribbled on the board, his name is John, that his tongue was loosed. So, first of all, family names were almost always used in those passages, and those biblical character names are pretty well defined. We do read some people that says James, Joseph, who was called Joseph. Sometimes the passage itself is explicit. Other times we could see, Zacchaeus, Zechariah. The root stems are the same, so we see that happen. It happens even in Israel today. Because Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, when they name kids, they tend to smash all the consonants together. So if one of my tour guides is named Shlomo. Okay, Shlomo is Solomon. Now if you think about it, Shlomo, S-L-M, it's got the consonants kind of all up front, and then they put the vowel after it. Or Moshe. which is the Jewish form of Moses. So some of those are like, we know Thomas and Tommy, right? We don't have to do any work to recognize that Tommy and Thomas. Some of them we have to do a little bit of work, Richard, Dick, okay, that requires a little bit more of it. But once you make that connection, you see it all the time, over and over again, you say, okay, Richard means Dick. And so between frequency of usage of the variant and the explanation of the variant in certain times, and when the same person is referred to in multiple stories by different names, which happens a lot, especially in the Old Testament, then we can draw those kind of conclusions, and they're reasonable conclusions.